The late arrivals home, the phone face down on the table, the irritability when she asked if something was wrong, the evenings at the gym. She thought about Renee and her descriptions of marital difficulty and the way she had sometimes, during those kitchen table conversations, looked away at a particular moment, the way a person looks away when they are editing something before they say it. She thought about the new energy Renee had seemed to carry even as she described her marriage as struggling. She thought about a dozen conversations and a dozen moments that had not registered individually as significant, but that rearranged in this new light. And I formed a pattern as clear as a drawing that had appeared on paper only when you looked at it from the right distance. She waited 3 days. She did not confront because she understood, with a kind of tactical intelligence that surprised her in retrospect, that confrontation without evidence was a door that could be closed. She needed evidence. She did not need to know for her own certainty. She already knew. She needed something she could hold in her hands and point to, because she understood that the moment she raised this, Daniel would deny it, and Renee would deny it. And without something concrete, they would have sufficient deniability to gaslight her into doubting what she had seen and felt and understood. On the third day, while Daniel was at work and the children were at school, she went to his home office. She sat down at his desktop computer, which had been his and which he used occasionally for work from home. She knew his password. She had always known his password. There had never been a reason not to. What she found over the following 4 hours was the architecture of a secret life, not hidden well enough, because it had been conducted partly through email accounts that were not entirely separate from shared spaces, partly through text messages that had been backed up to a cloud she had access to, partly through a carelessness that perhaps comes from being very certain that your partner will never think to look. The emails began in February. She went back through them, reading carefully, and the story assembled itself with a terrible precision. The first messages were professional in tone, the kind of thing that could be explained away. Small references to things they had apparently discussed in person, brief and slightly too warm, but not definitively inappropriate. By March, the warmth had intensified. By April, there were messages that could not be read as anything other than what they were. By June, there were messages that made Caroline, who had been reading with a calm that she would later describe as completely dissociated from her actual emotional state, have to put her hands flat on the desk and breathe through her nose for 30 seconds before she could continue. 6 months. At minimum 6 months. Possibly longer. The emails she had access to only went back to February, but there were references in some of the later ones to things that had apparently happened before February. And there was a quality to the early February messages, a familiarity, an ease that suggested that whatever this was had been established well before the first email in the archive she was reading. She made copies. She saved them. She put them in a folder on a flash drive she bought that afternoon at a pharmacy 2 towns over. She was methodical in a way that she would later say felt like it belonged to someone else, like she had stepped outside herself and watched someone competent and deliberate do what needed to be done, while the real Caroline stood a few feet away and observed. She also, because she is the kind of person who is thorough, went through his phone that same evening. She told him she was having trouble with her phone and could she borrow his to look something up. He handed it to her without hesitation, which told her either that he was confident everything incriminating had been deleted or that he had simply, in the accumulated arrogance of months of successful deception, stopped being careful. She did not find recent messages. She found, however, a series of deleted text conversations that had not been fully purged, and which, in their fragmented form, confirmed everything she had already found. She continued to be normal. This is the part of the story that is perhaps the most quietly extraordinary, the part that speaks to something particular about who Caroline was. For the next 2 weeks, she continued to be normal. She made dinner. She helped with homework. She smiled at the right times. She texted Renee as she always had. She went through every ordinary motion of her ordinary days while carrying this knowledge like a stone inside her chest. She did this not out of weakness, but out of deliberateness. She needed to understand the full shape of what she was dealing with before she decided how to respond to it. She told no one, not her mother, not her sister, not a single person in the network of people who loved her and who would have rushed to her side if they had known. She held it alone, the way you hold a thing when you are still deciding what to do with it. She worked. She cooked. She drove the children to school and attended Ethan's baseball game and helped Grace with a school project about the American robin. She functioned fully and convincingly as the version of herself that the world expected to see. But in the quiet of her own mind, in the hours when the house was asleep and she lay with her eyes open in the dark, she was doing something else entirely. She was grieving the past, reconstructing it memory by memory, revisiting every shared moment of the last several years through the corrective lens of what she now knew. She was doing the painful, necessary work of figuring out which memories were real and which ones had been built on a foundation of lies. She was separating, like a jeweler separating gold from ore, the genuine from the false. And she was deciding what she wanted, not what she should want, not what the women in her family had traditionally done, not what would be easiest or most forgiving. What she, Caroline Mitchell, at 38 years old, aided with 2 children and a home, and a history and a body that had just absorbed one of the most significant shocks of its existence, actually wanted. She chose a Sunday evening. The children were at her mother's house for the weekend, something that had been planned months in advance. A sleepover that Ethan and Grace had been looking forward to for weeks. They had left that morning with their backpacks and their sleeping bags and their grandmother's unmistakable excitement at getting to spoil them. The house was quiet in the way that houses with children in them are only ever quiet when the children are gone, a particular kind of full silence that still carries the shapes of the people who usually fill it. She made dinner, not because she owed it to him or because she wanted the comfort of routine, but because she needed to have something to do with her hands for the first hour. She made pasta, the kind from scratch, the kind that takes focus, and she stood at the counter and rolled and cut and fed the dough through the machine, and she held herself together in the way she had been holding herself together for 2 weeks. They sat down to eat. He poured wine. He talked about something that had happened at work. She listened, or appeared to listen, in the way she had been appearing to do many things for the past 14 days. Then she set down her fork. She set it down quietly, not dramatically, not as a signal. Just set it down. And she said, "I need to talk to you about something." There are moments in a marriage, in any long relationship, that become permanent markers, before and after points. The story that Caroline would eventually tell herself about her life would be divided forever into before that Sunday and after it. Not because of what Daniel said in response, though what he said mattered. Not because of what followed, though what followed would change the topography of her life entirely, but because in the act of setting down her fork and saying those 7 words, she crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and she knew it, and she did it anyway. Daniel looked at her across the table, and in his face, in the very first fraction of a second before his expression arranged itself into something more managed, she saw it. The thing she had been dreading and expecting in equal measure for 2 weeks. The recognition. The knowledge that this was the moment he had perhaps known was coming. Then the briefest flicker of something that might, in another person, have been relief, and that in him was simply the visible crack in a facade that had been maintained with tremendous effort for a very long time. She did not ask him first. She did not give him the opportunity to frame this in his own language, to choose where the story began and how it was narrated. She told him what she knew, calmly, carefully, precisely, the way you lay out evidence when you need it to be undeniable. She told him what she had found in the emails. She told him about the text messages. She told him about the flash drive, which was sitting in her cardigan pocket as they spoke. She told him that she knew it had been going on since at least February, possibly longer. She told him that she knew who it was. The denial, when it came, lasted approximately 40 seconds. It was the kind of denial that people perform when they know it will not hold, but feel compelled to perform anyway. He said it wasn't what she thought. He said the emails were misinterpreted. He said there was a context she was missing. His voice, as he said these things, had a quality to it that she would later describe as the sound of a person who has rehearsed something for a long time and is now discovering, in the moment of performance, that the script has failed them. She took the flash drive out of her pocket and set it on the table between them. The denial stopped. What came next was not the movie version of a confrontation. There was no shouting, no thrown objects, no dramatic scenes. There was something far more devastating, which was the slow collapse of a person who has been caught, with the visible process of a human being who has been carrying a massive weight of deception, dropping it suddenly and all at once, and not knowing what to do with the absence of it. He put his face in his hands. He stayed that way for a long time. Then he looked up and he said, and this is something Caroline has repeated in trying to describe this night, something she has turned over and over in the years since. I'm sorry. I don't know how this happened. She told him that she needed him to be honest with her about two things. When had it actually started? And had Renee been the only one? He answered both questions, and the answers were not better than what she had already suspected. They were worse. It had started in January, 8 months before the party, and Renee had not been the first. And this is the moment in the story where the landscape shifts again, because what Caroline had been prepared for, what she had spent 2 weeks steeling herself for, was the discovery of a single betrayal, terrible enough on its own. What she had not been prepared for was the revelation that the past 8 months were not the aberration, but rather the most recent chapter of a pattern that went back years. There had been others. Not many, he insisted, not ongoing in the way that this had been ongoing, but others. She sat with that. She sat with it the way you sit with a piece of information that is too large to be processed in real time, that requires you to simply hold it and breathe and let it exist in the space around you before you try to absorb it. Then she stood up calmly and she said, I want you out of this house tonight. He went. He called his brother and he went, taking a bag that he packed in the silence while she sat in the living room and looked out the window at the backyard where the fire pit was still full of ash from the party. He left without the kind of scene that might paradoxically have been easier to endure. He left quietly, and the sound of the front door closing behind him was, in its quietness, one of the most shattering things she had ever heard. She sat in the silence of the house for a long time after that. Then she went upstairs, filled the bathtub, sat in it until the water went cold, and cried for the first time since the party. Not small, contained crying, the other kind. The kind that comes up from somewhere very deep and takes a long time to exhaust itself and leaves you feeling, when it's finally done, wrung out and raw and strangely, provisionally lighter. She called Renee the next morning. She had spent a significant portion of the previous night deciding whether to call at all, debating with herself about what there was to say, and whether saying it would serve any purpose beyond the satisfaction of being seen. She decided to call not out of anger, though anger was certainly present, and not out of the hope of reconciliation, because she knew with a clarity she could not have explained, but did not need to question, that the friendship was over. She called because Renee needed to know that she knew. That was all. That Renee should not be allowed to continue showing up in Caroline's world as if nothing had happened, as if the friendship were still intact, as if the 34 hours of genuine love and history between them had not been dismantled. We one choice at a time. Over 8 months of lies. Renee answered on the second ring. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who has been waiting for a call they knew was coming. Caroline said, I know, about everything. I don't want an explanation, and I don't want an apology. I just wanted you to know that I know. There was a pause that stretched longer than any pause in a conversation had any right to. Then Renee said her name. Just her name. And in the way she said it, in the shape of those 3 syllables, Caroline heard something she had not expected to hear. She heard the grief of a person who is confronted with the full weight of what they have done. Not excuse-making, not justification. Just the sound of someone who had done something terrible and knew it, and had apparently been carrying that knowledge for a long time. Sir, Caroline said, I hope you and Daniel are very happy. And she hung up. She did not speak to Renee again for a year and a half. The aftermath of a betrayal of this kind, when it involves not just a spouse, but a best friend, creates a particular kind of wreckage that is different in character from either loss alone. People who have studied this, therapists and psychologists who work with betrayed spouses, use a specific term for it. They call it the double betrayal, and they describe it as one of the most complex and difficult forms of loss a person can experience, because it involves not just the loss of a marriage, but the simultaneous loss of the primary support system that a person would ordinarily turn to when a marriage ends. When your marriage falls apart, you call your best friend. Not when your best friend is the reason your marriage fell apart. You stand at the edge of an abyss with no handrail. This is what Caroline faced. Not just the end of a 20-year marriage and the unraveling of a future she had planned and worked for, but the simultaneous absence of the one person in the world she would have called first. Every grief has its particular architecture, and this grief was structured in such a way that the most natural outlet for the pain was itself a source of the pain. It was, as one woman who had been through something similar described it in an online community where Caroline would eventually find herself reading late at night, like grieving two deaths and your own death at the same time, like losing three people in a single moment, your spouse, your best friend, one and the version of yourself who believed that both of them were who you thought they were. She told her mother first. Her mother was 63 and had been married to Caroline's father for 31 years and was the kind of woman who had a capacity for quiet, fierce love that expressed itself not in words but in action. Her mother did not cry. She drove 45 minutes to Caroline's house, and she let herself in with the key she had always had, and she sat down at the kitchen table, and she said, "Tell me everything." And then she listened for 2 hours without interrupting, without offering advice, without saying anything that minimized what her daughter had just survived. And when Caroline was done, her mother took her hands across the table and said very simply, "You are going to be okay. It will not feel that way for a while. Yeah, but you're going to be okay." That sentence would become something Caroline held on to over the following months in the way that people hold on to things that are small but true when everything large feels uncertain. The news spread, as it does in the world of interconnected social friendships, with a speed and comprehensiveness that is both inevitable and harrowing. Some people reached out immediately, warmly, without preamble, the way good people do. Some people went silent in the awkward way that people go silent when they don't know what to say, and the silence becomes, over time, its own kind of statement. And some people, because there are always these people, took sides in ways that felt arbitrary and cruel, and that said more about them than about either Daniel or Caroline. Curtis, Renee's husband, called Caroline 2 weeks after she had spoken to Renee. He had found out about the affair, he said, in a way that suggested that perhaps he had known for longer than he was saying, or perhaps he had not known at all. And the exact timeline of what Curtis knew, and when he knew it was something that Caroline did not have the capacity to investigate. He said he was sorry. He said he felt complicit in a way he hadn't been, because his wife had used his marriage as the backdrop for her deception, and he had not seen it. He said he hoped Caroline was okay, and that if she needed anything, he would do what he could. It was an awkward conversation, the kind that occurs between two people who are suddenly, involuntarily connected by a disaster they did not make and cannot unmake. She thanked him and meant it. She never spoke to him again after that. The divorce process began in November. Daniel, to his credit, or perhaps out of guilt, did not contest anything significant. He did not make things more difficult than they already were. He moved out permanently, found an apartment, maintained his responsibilities with Ethan and Grace in a way that Caroline later acknowledged, in her most honest moments, was consistent and genuine. Whatever he had done to their marriage, he did not take it out on the children. He showed up for school events. He paid child support without complaint. He did the basic things that good parents do, and Caroline, even in her grief and anger, acknowledged those things, if only to herself. Ethan was 9 and old enough to understand that something had happened, but not old enough to know what. Grace was 6 and primarily processed the change through the concrete reality of Daddy having a different bedroom now, a fact she found confusing and occasionally upsetting in the way that 6-year-olds process disruption, which is to say directly and loudly, and then apparently fine, and then suddenly devastated again at bedtime for reasons that seem to have nothing to do with anything, but are actually everything. Caroline navigated this with a care and a consistency that she would later describe as the hardest work she had ever done in her life. Harder than anything professional, harder than anything relational. While protecting your children from the full weight of your grief, while also being present enough that they feel safe, is an act of sustained emotional heroism that most parents in this situation perform invisibly and without acknowledgement. She also started therapy. This was not, she would tell people later, a natural or easy decision for her. She had grown up in a family that valued dealing with things internally, that was not dismissive of emotional difficulty, but that processed it within the family circle, through conversation and prayer, and the kind of practical, forward-moving approach to hardship that the Midwest tends to cultivate. Going to sit in a room and talk to a stranger about her feelings was not, initially, something that felt natural. Her therapist's name was Dr. Patricia Owens, and she had an office on the second floor of a building in downtown Columbus. And the first thing she said to Caroline, after Caroline had sat down and looked around at the diplomas on the wall, and the small succulent on the windowsill, and the box of tissues on the side table that announced, with its quiet practicality, that tears were expected and acceptable in this space, was, "Before we start, I want you to know that what you are feeling is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of having loved something deeply and lost it. There is no correct way to grieve that. There is only your way." Caroline cried for the entire first session. There is a phase that people who work with survivors of betrayal describe, which comes sometime after the initial shock and grief have passed their acute peak, but before the longer work of reconstruction has begun. It is the phase of reckoning, the phase in which you are forced, sometimes painfully, and sometimes with a clarity that feels close to surgical, to look at the full picture of what happened, not just the betrayal itself, but the conditions that surrounded it, the dynamics that preceded it, the questions about your own life and choices and patterns that you cannot answer without also being honest about things that are harder to face than the betrayal itself. For Caroline, this phase began around month 4. She had done most of the acute grieving. She had wept and raged and sat in silence and called her mother and come to session after session with Dr. Owens. And slowly, gradually,